Bon après-midi, good afternoon, guten Tag. My name is Serge Gauthier, and it's my pleasure to chair this session. These are the pictures and the names and topics that we will cover in the next hour. We will introduce each other as we go along. I'll give the introduction. So my presentation is about the shifting patient pathway in Alzheimer's disease. It is based on the World Alzheimer Report 2021, which was published electronically on September 21st. These are some pictures that say a lot of words in terms of what we found through surveys among persons living with dementia and their families, clinicians, and Alzheimer associations. There's a diagnosis of dementia taking place around the world. The costs are staggering and will increase. The number of people with dementia is increasing because of the aging of the population as a whole. The World Health Organization Global Action on Dementia is a target for all countries, and there are periodic documents giving updates on how the various targets are met. And for diagnosis, the number 4, we're far from reaching the diagnosis target. So the best estimate we have is among the low and middle income countries, the rate of diagnosis is in the order of 25%. That is a full diagnosis. Whereas in the higher income countries, it would be around 50%. Even the people who have a diagnosis, most of them, more than half, say that they require more information at the time of diagnosis. So this is a gap that we'll try to fill for the World Alzheimer Report 2022, which is post-diagnosis management. And there's still thinking among certainly older clinicians that why bother doing a diagnosis of dementia if there's no cure or no real disease-modifying treatment, but that's about to change. One of the surprises that among people with dementia and their families, close to half said they had difficulty finding a clinician to listen to them and make a diagnosis. So training of students in medical schools and other allied health professionals will be a team that will be built upon for the World Alzheimer Report 2022. We need to expand the pool of clinicians available and interested to make a diagnosis of dementia and to do long-term management. Because we do forecast the word tsunami has been used. A large number of people seeking consultation is expected because of aging of population, but also because there'll be new diagnostic tools and new treatments. And one of the factors that's identified among clinicians is the time factor. If you have only 5 minutes per person in your office, it's not enough to make a workup of dementia. Tsunami is an illustration we're using for the number of people expected to seek consultation for cognitive decline and possibly dementia. So here are some examples of recommendations within the report that you're welcome to peruse. I'll just flag some of the high points. Time pressure is a factor in the ability to assess someone. So perhaps one recommendation would be when you see someone over age 50, part of the routine questioning would be, is there a change in your memory or thinking in the past year? If yes, does it affect your daily life? Yes. Bring them back if you don't have time right away to probe further, and then you can do MMSE and MOCA and so on. There's good news that precision diagnosis is around the corner. There's plasma biomarkers for p-tau isoforms that are being documented as indicative of what's happening in the brain. And this will bring new challenges. What do you tell someone who's 65 who have a positive biomarker but very little symptoms? But we'll cross that bridge when we have that technology. Better training. I already mentioned that it should start at medical school, but hopefully there'll be opportunities for clinicians in mid-career to switch gear and move from internal medicine into cognitive assessment and treatment. So continuing medical education may be also something to look into. We expect increased diagnosis rate and accuracy based on biomarkers. And we make a plea that if people are looking up on the web for information about Alzheimer, dementia, biomarkers, they should use sites that have been vetted, such as Alzheimer Europe, Alzheimer Disease International, Alzheimer Association, etc. Yes, the WHO action plans, as I mentioned, are a target that all countries should keep an eye on, and there's periodic reports about progress. We need to do better for diagnosis, for sure. The spinal fluid examination currently is the most cost-effective way to do a biological diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment or dementia. So there has to be more availability for the analysis of the spinal fluid at affordable cost, and clinicians should not be afraid to propose spinal fluid examination. It is truly currently the most cost-effective biological diagnostic approach. Post-diagnosis support. So there's still too much of good luck and no plan is offered. It should be as structured as cancer management, where there is a nurse or a contact person for the follow-up. There's referral to community, to Alzheimer associations and support services throughout the course of the disease. We need more research into precision medicine. Fortunately, there is an enthusiasm currently for plasma biomarkers that will pay off. Yes, the Alzheimer associations play a key role. They do have already on their websites a lot of information that it should be looked at. We don't have to wait for new information to be created by universities, although there are efforts at creating education packages geared for the stage of disease at which the person is. Telemedicine is one of the positive outcome of the current pandemic. More clinicians have used telemedicine, and at least for follow-up, it has worked well. And there's an interest in developing remote assessment tools for cognition, function, behavior, and mood. So this may be a way to reach out to people living far away from centers, or living in rural regions or geographically distant regions, or having physical limitation to go for their follow-ups. And this is the end of my part. We will have a question period at the end. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sonya Miller from the United Kingdom, who will talk about how to conduct a phase 3 trial in a global pandemic. Please, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Serge. Very warm welcome to everybody who has joined us today. Thank you for your time. So I will be talking about how we managed our trial during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's very interesting when we think now it's nearly 2 years that we've all been dealing with the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. It's affected every aspect of our life and, of course, has affected how we run our clinical trials, and certainly will be with us for a long time to come and will be a part and parcel of current and future trials for all of us involved. So the big questions, of course, which occurred way back at the beginning and still continue, of course, is can the trial actually continue? Can sites continue to function? And that's not just the research sites, it's all of the vendor sites. Does our planning ensure safety? And that's of everybody involved, of the patients, study partners, site staff, and the vendors. A risk-benefit analysis and a risk analysis, and when does normal return? And as we've seen, normal hasn't actually returned. It's become a new normal that we're all dealing with, and we're seeing this now with the new variants coming in, the Delta variant, of course, we're all familiar with, and now Omicron, and the various stages of lockdown. So the big answers, and these are the big answers, and of course there's a lot of medium and small ones underneath. So the risk-benefit analysis is all to do with whether we could justify continuing our trial and our study. And of course, we all know that Alzheimer's dementia is a progressive, destructive disease. It is considered a terminal condition. So we would justify it by saying the only access for a lot of patients to get ongoing care would be to be able to access the sites and have access to a randomized clinical trial for a potential disease-modifying treatment. The risk assessment was more granular, where we actually looked at sites in particular, broke it down into the visits that were required, and I'll go into that a little bit more. And we also developed a new protocol version, which encompassed all of the COVID-19 mitigations and planning that we put in place. So if we looked at the risk-benefit assessment, as I said, it was how we justify continuation of a study given the restrictions of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we were considering the patient safety because we've got an older age demographic, of course, their ability to travel to site, to the scanning sites, for instance. They have a higher level of comorbidities, might have needed to shield early on in the process before the vaccination programs took place, for instance. We also have to consider the study partner. It's sometimes they're of a similar age, if it's a spouse or a partner. They may be younger if it's family or friends, but they have issues as well with travel, access, whether they needed to shield. And we also looked at the sites themselves. So before any site was activated in our study, we had a very strong dialogue between us about exactly what their mitigations and planning processes were. So that was right down to sort of social distancing, PPE, the deep cleansing, the arrangements for patients, and this extended to the vendors as well that were providing, for instance, the labs and the scanning. And I must say that the sites were very innovative and flexible and worked very well with us on this. And for instance, some of the MRI scanning sites allowed patients to stay in their cars with their study partners until they were due to come in for the actual scan. So they didn't need to sit in a waiting room with other people. And these were just examples of how people really start to think outside of the box about how we make this work and keep it safe. So the visit-by-visit breakdown, of course, the critical visits that we needed to really have in person to make the study work and be safe was, of course, the screening processes, your randomization visit where you first dispense your IMP, and, of course, the first visit after that, which was 4 weeks in our case. The other critical visits then for us, for our study, were the end of our first 12-month double-blind period, because then the patients rolled into an OLEX phase where everyone went on to active. So the people who had been on placebo in the double-blind phase were treatment naive as such, so it was very important to make sure that they had no adverse events or issues once going into the OLEX phase. So, and of course, any early termination visit would need that on-site visit as well, if possible. Apart from the first post-randomization visits, the rest of our study visits were quite well spaced. There was 13 weeks between each visit. So realistically, we didn't see that 2 consecutive visits were ever missed. And this gave us that sort of comfort zone, if you like, in enabling to make sure that we did see people without too big a gap there, even if sometimes a visit may have been a bit delayed. So the risk impact, as I've already discussed, the critical thing here is just to reinforce that always, it came down to the subject, the patient's decision and their study partner about whether they wanted to continue, wanted to access the study. And this was always a very flexible process and pathway, where this could change obviously at any time, and this was affected by local regulations and restrictions as well. The investigators always retained the unilateral decision-making process as well, of whether they thought that it was safe, that they could manage the study and they could manage the patients. And this also was important to take into account because site staffing may have been an issue, that not just for the patients, but the actual site staff. Did they have mitigations in place for if raters, for instance, were off because of shielding or contact tracing, for instance? So the new protocol version that we put out for COVID-19, this was way back at the beginning, really, of the whole pandemic. We looked at the study conduct, as I've been discussing. We looked at the study monitoring. So we were thinking about remote monitoring for sites and how we access them. And we were looking at statistical analysis. So our statistical analysis plan would take into account any visits that were affected by COVID in any way. And the PI at site had the ability to mark any visit as potentially affected by COVID. We had a specific ECRF built into the study to enable us to identify those and what exactly was affected. So some of the practicalities of this, what we actually did was during the screening, which was quite a long process, we allowed pauses if, for instance, a patient was affected by COVID in some way. So a contact tracing where they had to isolate, or local legislation, local authority rulings changing in terms of travel, for example. So we didn't require them to repeat processes that had already been completed during the screening. So it was allowed to be stretched, and clearly that was, again, always assessed on a case-by-case basis. You can't allow years of a screening pause, clearly, but certainly we're very flexible about time. The location of assessments was very interesting because we established a hierarchy, and I'll show you that on the next slide. For bloods, for instance, of the preferences were, of course, at site, clearly as a face-to-face if possible. The next preference down would then be at another safe place or site, so that could be the GP practice or the primary care provider's practice. And then, of course, at the patient's home, if that was appropriate. And we put in mitigations and trainings in place for site staff that they would be able to visit a patient in their home to, for example, conduct a blood draw or do a rating scale. We also had the potential to directly ship our study drug to patients. That was with an independent vendor that acted on our behalf. And there was also a whole raft of mitigations put around that in terms of how that was documented and managed and accounted for. The efficacy scales were very challenging, as you can imagine, and I'll go on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. This was the example of the hierarchy of preference for the bloods, for example. As I said, on-site, local labs, local GP, or a home blood draw if required. The efficacy scales were really, really interesting, and this provided sort of probably the biggest challenge for us. There was some evidence for validation of delivering the scales remotely for the MMSE and CDR and even the ADL. However, the ADAS-COG was the challenging one, and the ADAS-COG and the ADL are in fact our primary clinical endpoints for the study. We developed a system whereby we could deliver the ADAS-COG remotely, and interestingly, we haven't actually had to deploy that as yet. And hopefully we don't, as we're progressing very well through the study at the moment. It did require a lot of assessment by IT, for instance, of how we could bring a tablet. We looked at whether we used phones or tablets or laptops. It was a tablet decision, how that was delivered to patients at home, how it was accounted for, how we made sure it was wiped clean at the end of each assessment, and that the patients actually were able to access and use the tablet so they had a viable internet connection, for instance, or had someone that could be on hand to help them access the system. We looked at all the data protection issues. We instituted mandatory training for the raters who would perform the remote scales and issued several guidance documents about how to actually do the scales, log it, and all the other parts that were mandated. Sites also had to request permission from the sponsor in order to initiate a remote scale. So it's been quite an interesting sort of setup, and I think is certainly the way that things may be moving, as Serge alluded to in his recommendations, that remote visits, monitoring and of patients is really one of the big things that has come out of this whole pandemic situation. So the ongoing risks, of course, COVID has proven to be a very long-term stayer, a wickedly clever virus. It mutates, it is rapid in its spread and its adaptability. So you have to always be concerned with it and assess as we go. So it's the potential impact on our data, and as I said, we're very aware. We have the specific CRFs to note if there's been any impact by COVID in any way on the patient visit. The patient impact of whether they are still able to manage with the study and their study partners, whether they have had to move because of care issues or location issues, and the disease itself, as we said, it continues to mutate and present different challenges to any of the studies. Just some COVID metrics to finalise up here on this section. We've only had one death related to COVID. We've had very few SAEs and AEs. In fact, I've been quite pleasantly surprised because I was expecting more given the severity of the disease and the particular patient demographic that we're dealing with. We are actively asking the sites to actively query all the patients about their vaccination status because the visits are 13 weeks apart. Sometimes they forget to mention it. So the numbers that we have here for number vaccinated appear a little low. In my considerations, we have over 500 patients enrolled, so that would be a little low, I would think, and we are actively asking people to query that and document that very carefully. Also, the COVID-specific withdrawals have been extremely low given the number of patients and the length of the study. We're almost through the first 12 months of the study, in fact. So overall, we did manage to over-recruit, and we have managed to keep the safety. We know we have a safe IMP as well, so that gives us extra confidence in running the study safely for everyone involved. And it's been an amazing effort all round by everybody involved with the study, sites, staff, patients, and us. It's quite heroic, but terribly important that we're able to keep the momentum going and for these type of studies in this time and age of COVID. So I'll pass on now to my colleague Linda Sommerlade, who will be talking about the development of new diagnostics that go hand in hand with the clinical studies that we are running. So thank you very much, Linda.
Thank you, Sonya, for the introduction. Yes, my name is Linda Sommerlade. I am Head of Operations at GT Diagnostics. So if we're looking back at the ADI report, of which Serge already told us a little bit in detail, one of the findings was that an estimate of 75% of people with dementia are actually not diagnosed at all. So if we illustrate this in this picture where we've got the people, and we're seeing here in gray the over 45 population, we're highlighting those who are diagnosed with dementia. That would just be 3 in 500 people, and a further 9 in 500 are undiagnosed. But actually, this is just the tip of the iceberg. If we also take into account those who are at Bragg stage 2 or beyond, those are people who have already changes in their brain, but not really any symptoms of Alzheimer's or dementia yet, but they are on the track or they are on the path that might and likely will lead them to the disease. So we see there's a lot of people who don't know yet what is going on, and we think they should know. So this is what early diagnosis is all about. Think of an example like your car. If you're driving along the road, you don't want your car to just drop dead because your engine failed. You want to see an engine light before that so that you can make plans, take your car to the garage and all the rest of it. And similarly for Alzheimer's and dementia, we want to diagnose early so people get a warning light when things are still relatively normal for them, so they can plan ahead and manage expectations of family and friends. They can maybe want to do some lifestyle changes, do some traveling they'd always wanted to do, or also looking ahead at maybe enrolling already when they can still do so themselves in specialized daycare or whatever they wish to do. The important part here is that they'll be empowered to make their own decisions because they know early enough to do that. And of course, one important aspect here is also to look into potential treatments so that there's a better chance of managing disease. So the current patient journey is a long and winding road. It involves several visits to clinics and specialized appointments, wait periods. And at the end of it, at the moment, there isn't even much that can be done. As Serge was pointing out, some clinicians don't even bother to diagnose because there isn't any disease-modifying treatment available yet. We believe that in part, this delay and long-winded road is also due to maybe outdated or old tools being used. So for example, the MMSE is often used in cognitive assessments, but it was created in 1975, a time when the rotary phone was still in use. Today, we are using mobile phones that can do so much more. So we're not dismissing the older technology, right? The rotary phone was designed to make and receive calls. The modern phones can still do that, but as I said, they can do so much more. And we're hoping that a similar thing can happen to Alzheimer's diagnosis. We can use the benefits and the or the lessons learned from the existing tools to add so much more to it. From the GT Diagnostics perspective, the ideal patient experience would be that they can take first steps in the comfort of their home using some gamified assessment tool. Then they go to their GP, family doctor, in the waiting room, do another assessment and get confirmation of maybe what the tool at home already showed. And then maybe even the GP or family doctor can already, in the straightforward cases, prescribe treatment without any further appointments necessary. Brief introduction, who we actually are. Been talking to you for a little while already and didn't introduce GT Diagnostics much. So we are a company originally established in Malaysia. Since last year, we also have a wholly owned subsidiary in the UK. We want to change the diagnostic landscape in dementia. That's our vision. And we're currently working on 4 diagnostic and monitoring tools, which are all in their late stage development phases. So this is an overview of our products in development. I will very briefly go through them on this slide and then show you in detail on separate slides a little bit more of each of them. So we've got on the very left, HiPal and memory testing. This is a well-being app that people can use in their home just to test their memory, and then if they're worried with their results, go on to see a doctor. HiPal Pro is the professional counterpart of HiPal. It's an advanced memory testing tool designed to be self-administered. So the patient could do it in the waiting room while they wait for their appointment with the clinician, who can then immediately see the results and interpret them and use them in their diagnosis. Psychox is a cognitive testing tool. It's a specialized tool, and I'll tell you a bit more about the details later on, but it needs to be administered by a clinician or a medical professional. And Signex is an imaging analysis tool based on EEG, standard EEG assessment, and gives some advanced analysis scores out of that. So HiPal memory testing, as I said, a well-being app that people who are worried whether they're well or unwell, they won't know, can use at home to monitor their cognitive status, their memory performance, and then decide what to do with the results themselves. As you can see on the right in this screenshot, it's just a memory game, or it looks like a memory game. And then patients can get an output. Patients, not anybody, it's not just for patients. This is for anyone who is interested in their cognitive health. They can then see on a timeline how their score changes over time. And again, if they're worried, go and seek further help. The general idea of HiPal is that you measure, you monitor, and then if you're worried, you can go and share that with your healthcare professions. HiPal Pro is the advanced big brother of HiPal, so to speak. It's self-administered as well. It's got some additional assessment in there to just test more cognitive aspects, and gives a professional output to the clinician. So what we see here is a screenshot of what a patient would see. This is an example of what the clinician would then see on the other side. So what we give out is a predicted MMSE score and a predicted ADAS score. So that doesn't mean we do an MMSE, but based on our study data that we have collected, we can use this assessment to predict what an MMSE score would likely be for this patient. So yeah, the HiPal Pro uses speed and accuracy trade-off, conscious learning, and metacognitive judgment to predict the MMSE or ADAS score. Psychox is the more advanced computer adaptive testing tool. So basically it's a questionnaire presented electronically, but not just that, not just a full questionnaire. It will select the next question based on the patient's ability, and also at any point in time it can be stopped and will give an output score with confidence intervals. So in contrast to traditional questionnaire tests, you don't need to get to the very end. You can get a score out halfway through already. So this is a bit of the output, what it looks like, how the score, and it's score in different domains even, that then converge to a value, and you can at any point stop and you then get the value and the confidence intervals. So One aspect of cycles that I haven't talked about yet is that it is trying to detangle also the different aspects, the depression, function, and cognition aspects of the questions that are asked. Yeah, Signix is an EEG network analysis tool. So a standard EEG, as in this picture, it would be recorded. There's no specific equipment that is needed. Any kind of EEG tool will do. And then what we produce with our advanced analysis tools is an output that might look like what we see here, with some graphics representing the patient's scoring and a bit of instructions or detailed descriptions so that clinicians can form an opinion on that. So Signix got several elements to it. As I said, we're using standard EEG recording, and we're using some established AD biomarkers. We have developed a data harmonization technology, which is why we can use any kind of EEG machine for this. And we've got patented network analysis that goes into it, and it will then spit out a patient-specific score. So I hope that was of some interest to hear about some of our tools there. Speaker will be Bjoern. He is CEO at GT Diagnostics, but also heavily involved in biostatistics at TauRx. Bjoern, over to you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Yeah, I tried to put together a bit of the story you heard so far, and I take the liberty of speculating a bit what these trials and these new tools will provide us in terms of novel insights into dementia and the disease itself. We heard from Serge highlighting the ADI report, what the scale of the problem is, what the biggest challenges are that people, that clinicians are facing, and how they could potentially be addressed. We heard from Sonya about how a clinical trial was modified in order to allow it to run during a COVID pandemic, a global pandemic. And we heard from Linda that there are novel tools, and these tools try to diagnose dementia earlier, but they are also useful as a monitoring tool at later stages of the disease progression. And how this all links in to running a trial in a global pandemic and lessons learned for the real life after the pandemic, I think is what I try to be discussing now. You see a summary of what Sonya presented already. A clinical trial in a global pandemic needed adjusting, so changes needed to be implemented due to COVID. You heard about them in detail in Sonya's talk. Changes to the study conduct, changes to the study monitoring. It is both efficacy monitoring, but also safety monitoring. And what Sonya also highlighted is there need to be some changes to the statistical analysis. And on the next slide, I show a bit of why that is a problem. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Is that some of the questionnaires used in the clinical trials, and it's not just the one TauRx runs, but all running clinical trials in dementia, they rely on questionnaires. And these questionnaires are made up of individual questions. And some of the questions are, have you been out shopping in the past 4 weeks? If in a global pandemic, people need to self-isolate or are afraid of the virus and don't leave their homes, the question loses its meaning, because the answer is very likely no, but it's not no because they have not the functional capability anymore to go shopping. They are just not able to, or were told to shield, or were too, as I said, afraid to go out. So that's impacting the answer to that question. Similarly, questions around traveling outside their home. A similar thing, you wouldn't be doing it if you're isolating or if you are afraid of the virus. So in a clinical trial, when you run it, you need to adjust the analysis methodology. You can't simply assume that the answers, the no answers, are really reflective of the functional performance of a subject. You heard about the cognitive performance assessment challenges that Sonya mentioned. How can you apply a tool remotely that hasn't been validated for that and need some form of interaction with the patient, how can you do these things? And all of that needs to be addressed in the analysis, in the way we analyze the trial data. But this in turn is then also a lesson learned for the diagnosis in general, because a question like, did the subject ever go out shopping in the past 4 weeks to assess the functional capabilities, is strongly impacted by a global pandemic. And once hopefully COVID is over at some point very soon, there might be something else coming up. Can we learn lessons? Can we do things to modify these assessments in order to make them useful for remote application, to make them robust, should something like that ever happen again? I know we all hope it will never happen again, but it certainly can. And this means we need to bring the diagnostic tools to the 21st century. That is something that Linda already mentioned. There are companies working on developing tools that can be remote administered, that use technology of the 21st century in order to do this. This also has an advantage because we can, in that process, not only remove questions which don't make sense anymore in a global pandemic, but we can at the same time also remove questions which still would make sense in a global pandemic, but are simply outdated because the tools have been developed so many years ago. Another example from the ADL is, have you used a telephone book in the past 4 weeks? I guess the answer for, in particular, younger people will be no, because we are not using telephone books anymore if we want to make a telephone call. We rely on the internet, we rely on search engines, or we have them stored in our telephones and can access them through this. So these new technologies that come in, that bring everything to the 21st century, can remove questions which are outdated, but they can also use modern technology, remote assessment, to allow people, as we have seen in the previous talk, to do assessments in the comfort of people's home. On the next slide, if you could go to that, please. I'm picking up on a point that Serge mentioned earlier. The global pandemic has, and it might sound a bit weird, but has taught us some positive things in all the problems it has caused us and all the disasters. Some positive things as well. We have seen that telemedicine is becoming possible. People getting used to it, the technology is being invented, is being progressed a lot faster, because we now see the need in order to care for our elderly people, patients, or the general public. And this can be done through the remote assessment tools. And we have seen, again, from the clinical trial, that remote assessment is in principle possible, even in a clinical trial environment, which is highly regulated. So we should be able, with a lot of effort, to bring that into daily routine as well. We are not there yet. Lots of questions, as Serge also said, partly answered. We need to think about data protection. We need to think about how do we make sure that the people using these tests can use these tests. We need to make sure that they are meaningful, that they give us the information, that the correct conclusions can be drawn, and that we have all the follow-up steps in place as well. So once diagnosis, once there is an issue identified, what's next, and how do we deliver that through telemedicine? And this brings me to my last topic, and that is on the next slide, because if you could go to that, thank you. There is also a change to dementia potentially. And through these tools, but also through trial data that has been collected during the global pandemic, we will learn something more about dementia as well. We have data from people where the visits were impacted from dementia in the clinical trials. We have data from patients that were less impacted or non-impacted by the pandemic. We have data that has the questions in, have you been out for shopping in the past 4 weeks? But we obviously also thereby have data that excludes that, because we can, in all the analysis, exclude that. And all this will allow us to model, to get a better feeling for how the pandemic has changed dementia. Are people declining faster because they have less social contacts? was the use of video conferencing software so successful that it might even be an improvement, or at least a non-change in decline. And we also see through the questionnaire data that we collect during these pandemic, what the individual scores do. Because obviously, if I want to quantify functional decline or cognitive decline, I can't do that independently of an assessment tool. I need to look at my MMSE score, my ADAS-Cog score, my ADL score, my FAQ score, whatever we use, but we only see it in light of that. And we see it in light of that in the presence of a pandemic, and not in the presence of a pandemic. And then if you think about the tools again, tools like the ones Linda mentioned that allow to distinguish depression from cognitive decline, from functional decline, we'll get a much more comprehensive picture of what the disease does, and hopefully find a cure very soon to this devastating disease. And with this, I'll go to the last slide, which basically shows the contact details of the companies involved. And I think I'll hand back to Serge now to lead the panel discussion. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Now we can have everybody on screen, and people who are listening can write on the chat their questions. I have prepared some questions as you were talking, team. Let's start with Sonya, if I may. The ADAS-Cog validation as a remote test, is this something you've discussed with regulators as the study was unfolding?
We weren't able to discuss it with the regulators as we unfolded. We discussed it with the vendor, which is Medavante, previously Bracket and now WCG map. They have the sort of broadest experience, if you like, because they're the ones managing the scales for us. We must qualify it by saying, of course, with the ADAS-Cog, you can't get a total score because certain of the subsets cannot be analysed, like ideational praxis, for instance. So we have looked at every subset of the ADAS-Cog itself and determined what could be scored remotely and what could not be. The impact, as Bjoern has indicated, we will find only really towards the end of the study when everything's unblinded, and when we're able to look at all of the data and see whether the ADAS-Cog genuinely was impacted by COVID itself or not. As far as the remote assessment, as I said, we haven't actually had to deploy one as yet. So we will see that the numbers will be exceedingly small, if at all, depending on what the Omicron does now. But that will be part of the whole going to the regulators at the appropriate time, yes.
Indeed. Would you predict that if it's confirmed that the modified ADAS-Cog and similar scales are useful, it may make it easier for future studies with less in-person visits required for elderly people or people living some distance away from the sites?
Absolutely. I think, as everyone's been discussing, this is the way medicine is moving in general. For even GPs are doing, remote teleconferencing now for their assessments. There will always be certain assessments that have to be done in person. Always. You will never fully replace that. But if we can minimise the need for that contact in an effective and validated way, that's certainly incumbent on all of us involved in trials to explore those options.
I must say that as a neurologist, looking at the new normal,
Yes.
we are thinking of possibly having pre-screening done remotely by people using validated scales like the minimal behavioral impairment scale, some ADL scale, and maybe the MoCA electronic version. And if people score abnormally, then they would go see their GP, and maybe in 3 years we'll have the screening blood test, the way we use screening blood tests for diabetes type 2. And if it's abnormal, there's an in-person visit and then a referral to a specialist. I would predict there'll be a change in the way people get to the specialist. Otherwise, we won't be able to deliver. There's just not enough specialists.
Yeah, and absolutely. It's all about access and immediacy. People get disheartened if they don't have a pathway. And if you think about medicine over the last few decades, we've taken the challenge of each decade. For instance, cardiovascular disease, then it was cancers of various sorts. Our challenge now is neurodegeneration. It's Alzheimer's. People are surviving their heart attacks, their cancer, and they are living long enough, if you like, or well enough that this is now becoming the major issue. And as you say, you need a patient pathway. People need somewhere to go, and clinicians need somewhere to send their patients as well. And as you say, point of contact is critical. So the remote assessments are an integral part of this. The diagnostic tools that Linda and Bjoern have explained are an integral part of this, and certainly a blood test. So you can give an instant, easily accessible and acceptable procedure to a patient. Nobody minds a blood test in general, as opposed to a long, lengthy, quite invasive scanning procedure sometimes. It is very scary for a lot of patients. So if we can get to the point of remote assessments, the blood testing, and then, okay, we have a clearer idea exactly of where you are and what you need. That's surely the aim for all of us in this.
Super.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm unmuting myself. May I ask Linda if there is a minimal education level required to use the tools you described? It may be an issue in lower and middle income countries.
Yes, you may ask, of course. The Hyper and Hyper Pro tools, they work with images. So currently instructions are to be read by the patient, but that could be replaced by an audio playing the instructions. So literacy is not an issue. It is images and then remembering where they were. So I would say it's very accessible, and it can be culturally adapted by using images that people know from their everyday life, of course.
I must say that's very reassuring, because one of the things that came out from the surveys around the world for the World Alzheimer Report 2021 was the language and culture of the tools commonly used. We gave as an example the VCAT, Visual Cognitively Adapted Testing, that was developed in Singapore, and actually the test is in the book, so people can have a look. And thank you very much for thinking ahead of using pictures and audio and making the tools adaptable to various cultures and countries. Very nice. I must ask all of you, we talk about cognitive screening test, a bit about function. Bjoern, you were very clear about why some questions are no longer appropriate, such as the phone book, but there's also a trend to find minimal behavioral changes. Everybody seems to be reporting the same finding, where you use the Behave AD or the minimal behavioral impairment checklist or the neuropsychiatric inventory. There is a subtle neuropsychiatric component to subjective cognitive decline and mild cognitive impairment. Do you think we should use not just cognitive screening tools and ADL checklists, but also some instrument for looking at change in personality and behavior? Maybe Bjoern, you'd like to.
If I can make a start, and maybe then Sonya and Linda can add to that. Yeah, I think one of the lessons learned also from the past and from all the trials that have been conducted is that it's not one decline that happens in dementia. Not everybody declines the same way. And if you get this information from different angles, and you can in particular distinguish, is it a behavioral change? Is it a depression? Is it a cognitive decline? What is actually the path of an individual into this terrible disease? That will then again allow potential better adjustments of treatment, better, if not a treatment, but better lifestyle adjustments as well, that might help some people to improve, or at least to live in as normal as possible for longer. So yeah, it's definitely worth looking into all of these and combining the information, because some of the questions, as I said, are a bit outdated now, but it's also a problem that that some questions are too difficult for some people, some questions are too easy for some people, and that then influences the results as well. So if I think about the MMSE, the question of serial sevens, can you subtract sevens several times from 100 and give me the correct result? If you, for instance, don't know what a pencil is anymore, or you can't remember anything, then this task is certainly much too difficult. So how can we find the right balances there, and how can we get the complete picture, I think is a very important aspect of all of this.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd sort of call it robust dinosaur tools, Serge. The ADAS cog and the AD they've been around for forever, for decades, and they're understood by everybody. But certainly what the last 2 years has shown us is they lack finesse in a certain way. Now, certainly when we set up our study, our current study, it was 2-3 years ago, or even a bit longer, but the current version was when these were the accepted scales to be used. These were robust, they were known, they were understood, they could be interpreted in terms of clinical meaningfulness at the end of the study. And the other issue is that the raters, when you're dealing with a study that is in multiple sites in multiple countries, you have the issue of rater training, and these ones are deliverable and understood, and you have the experience already there. So having said that, I think you're right, that scales like this need more finesse to detect more subtle changes as we're understanding more and more and more about these sort of the paradigm, if you like, of AD and MCI due to AD. This, though, of course, involves then extensive rater training to understand these subtleties, because you find sometimes, and also different cultures or languages, even how a question is phrased can alter the answer. And I will say that we do have an independent central review of all of our scales throughout the study, so that any sort of querying on how things are scaled or scored is addressed immediately. So it's not left to the end. So we're right on top of it.
We have a listener asking a question to you. Attention. If you ship the drug to participants, how do you make sure that the drug is taken correctly as written in the protocol? Are you involving carers?
Very, very good question. And yes, and this is an issue not just if you ship directly. With a particular patient population, this can be an issue in general about taking a medication correctly. And there are compliance checks, of course, for the medication at every visit. Again, there is a very sort of set format of how it's delivered, how it's signed for, who acknowledges receipt, the amounts, and the reconciliation of the amounts of IMP. But of course, nothing is fail-safe, and we were looking for ways that we could still deliver the IMP to patients if for some reason they couldn't come in. It was not a first-line strategy. This was part of the strategy to ensure continuum of care.
Thank you. There's a question about the MMSC with different meanings depending on the author and the country. We sort of addressed that already to some degree. The other question is the flexible arrangements you describe in the protocol. Will this last? Will this continue beyond COVID? And we sort of answered that already, that we will keep the best of what we've learned for assessments and decrease the number of visits in person if they're not essential, etc.
That's essential for all studies going forward, not just ours. I think that everyone has to be cognizant of the fact that there will be impositions now, that the freedom of travel we've always enjoyed just doesn't exist, this freedom of movement, for a whole variety of reasons. And you must inbuild that into your trial strategies, or you will fail. You won't be able to assure that sort of continuum of care and patient safety. So that's imperative.
I would predict it will help the retention rate.
Yeah.
And if we move to pre-symptomatic studies in younger people still at work, again, easier recruitment and better retention.
Exactly.
So that's another sort of positive result of the pandemic. We're finally adjusting just the tools, but how we reach and keep contact with people throughout lengthy studies, a year and a half, 2 years is not unusual now.
Yes, our current study is 2 years, but you find too that some people really want to make the contact. So this is why you need both arms within your study, protocol and design, because some people really, really value the contact, that sort of ability to speak to people in person, to discuss things. So you have to be aligned to both sort of sets of needs, if you like.
I'm glad you mentioned the need to have in-person contacts, because I have to ask Linda, what you're doing. Is it just for the young people like you, or middle-aged and older people also would like to use such tools?
We have actually tested some of it in a clinical trial study with AD patients and healthy control subjects. So the button size and the wording, and it's all accessible, it's all tested by patients with Alzheimer's. So that's not an issue. I think it will be for those as well. And we've not cut out the clinician contact time. We've just aimed to maximize it to have the clinician do what they do best, rather than ask questions and record answers and then somehow score the sheet. They will just get the score and then be able to talk to the patient, get the patient history, which we can't do with the tool very well, and then get the whole picture and have time to discuss a diagnosis, because they don't spend the time asking the questions that we can use technology for.
Super. Yeah. I think for the people listening to this symposium, you're getting a cautious, optimistic kind of message that you can do a clinical trial, double-blind, randomized, even the pandemic. And we've learned things from it that will outlast the pandemic to make the studies easier and as reliable in the future. And this may also translate to clinical practice. We may be able to do pre-visit assessments, and when you're in with the clinician in person, you can have your questions that you've prepared ahead of time, because the clinician will have more time because there's been some preparatory work before. There's also biological tests coming to remove some of the uncertainty we currently face with diagnosis, and particularly about the cause of your cognitive decline or dementia. So it's sort of a cautious, optimistic outcome, and I want to thank my colleagues for, I think, what has been a very dynamic and useful symposium. Thank you, Alzheimer Europe, for hosting us, and I wish you a good continuity in your meeting. Merci.